The far right, making gains in Europe and becoming more mainstream. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. All across Europe, from Sweden to Greece, far-right parties are gaining strength and winning seats in parliament. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni became Western Europe's first far-right prime minister since World War II when she was elected last year. Germany's far-right alternative for Deutschland just had a big victory in district elections and is surging in the polls. In France, Marine Le Pen and her party, which takes a hard line on immigration, look poised to make further political gains after the recent riots in Paris. And an upcoming election in Spain could see the hard-right Vox party enter parliament there. What's the appeal of the far right? And what could it mean for the future of the EU with elections for the European Parliament next year? To discuss all of this, joining me now is Joav Toker. He is an associate professor with the American Graduate School of International Affairs and Diplomacy in Paris. With us from Athens is Dimitrios Sotogionis. He is a journalist and correspondent for Star TV Greece. Also joining us is Klaus Loris. He's a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And from London, we are joined by Renaud Foucault. He is a senior lecturer in economics at Lancaster University. Welcome all of you to the show. Klaus, why don't I start with you? Can you set the table for us? Why are we seeing this shift to the right? Why are we seeing this kind of embrace of these far-right populist politicians?
Yeah, it's a very disconcerting development, and it probably started in the late 1970s when Jörg Haiser's right-wing party in Austria participated in the government in Austria in the late 1990s. And at that time, it caused a lot of concern. People didn't want to talk to the Austrians. They canceled diplomatic visits and political visits. But now, you know, in the meantime, the intervening 25 years almost, we almost got used to right-wing parties having participated in politics and even forming the government like in Italy. The main reason why is that people fear that we are lacking control and order, that they want to see a more orderly and a more stable world. And I think that drives a lot of people, a lot of voters to the right-wing parties, populist parties in all of Europe. It's very disconcerting, but our times seem to be chaotic. They seem to be very much in flux economically, politically. Of course, the war in Ukraine has contributed to that feeling of insecurity, and it seems to be increasing all over Europe.
And Dimitrios, and looking at the increase that he's describing, Spain has an election that's coming up on Sunday. Santiago Abascal is the leader of the far-right Vox party. We have an excerpt from comments he made in 2019, which kind of gives us a sense of his hardline anti-immigrant stance. Let's listen.
We are facing a real invasion of our national territory, an invasion directed and planned by a neighbouring country, an invasion that has brought thousands, mostly males at conscription age, to our country. Also many youngsters, minors who have been used as human bulldozers by Morocco.
So let me get your sense of him, the Vox party, and also what's happening there in Greece, where we've seen three far-right parties now in the Greek parliament.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for having me on the show. We're seeing a political trend. There's no doubt about this. We're seeing small parties from gaining popularity to actually governing, like we heard before, Italy, Sweden, Finland. We have many, many examples here in Greece. You're absolutely right. We recently had elections, and we had a far-right party, the Spartans, that got into the parliament for the first time with 4.7%. And that's very concerning to the other parties, of course, and to democracy in general, I would say. Three major factors here. It varies from country to country, but I would definitely say the economy is a big part of this. Immigration, of course, is a big part of this. And like we heard before, the war in Ukraine. People are feeling insecure. People are looking for change. And sometimes they feel like that's how they can express their political feelings.
Reno, let me get your sense on connective tissue, because as he just pointed out, each country is different. But is there a connective tissue that goes through all of these politicians in all these different countries?
I think one important element of the successful one, the one that get to power, is that they've very much changed their stance, at least on the economics, in the last 20 years. If you look at Marine Le Pen, 10, 15 years ago, she was about leaving the European Union, leaving the euro. In the far right in Italy, they were not only against the European Union, but they were also actively pro-Russian, supporting Putin. They've completely mainstreamed their view on that, and they are not very different from the conservative on economic issues. And at the same time, in the European Union, you've seen towards migration deals that are not very far away from what the far right was pushing 10 years ago. So the fact that we are paying Turkey, the fact that we are paying Tunisia to process migration on the behalf of the European Union, also the way you see in Greece, Frontex is behaving in a pretty harsh way towards migrants coming, there is a lot of mainstreaming of those successful parties, and the ones that stay in the fringe are the ones that keep those anti-European or perhaps closer to neo-Nazi affiliations.
Joab, let me ask you about the flip side of this. Obviously, there's the sender and then there's the receiver. Can you describe the people who are going to the polls and voting? Because we saw with Brexit, and even here in the United States with Trump, you see kind of aggrieved working class workers who feel like, you know, a lot of what they had is slipping away, and they tend to demonize. And these kind of candidates, these populist candidates, tend to grab this and they say, hey, look, these are the people that are responsible for what's happening to you. And they actually a lot of times offer simple solutions to really complex issues.
Right you are. Right you are on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and in the United States. Indeed, what we see over the last, let's say, 40 years roughly in Europe is actually in cycles, but in moderate cycles, we see different types of extreme right, different volumes of extreme right ideologies and leaders becoming, globally speaking, when we take the variety and the different cases all over the continent together in order to try to produce some kind of global analysis, we see that this extreme right is getting stronger and stronger. But, and this is very important in relation to your question, the entire public opinion volume in Europe is moving towards the right, not the extreme right necessarily, but towards the right. If we had some kind of barometer or thermometer of the overall left-right proportions of the way Europe votes, with all its variety and the number of nuances which actually separate Sweden from Italy, from Portugal, from Greece, from France, from Belgium, the overall public opinion in Europe is moving towards the right for, I'd say, at least a generation and a half, if not 2 generations. Now, every now and then there are exceptions to this major vector, if you wish, but the overall movement is going towards the right. And on the other side of the overall barometer, if you wish, we have a relative a weakness of center of the left, center left, and left of the center political parties and political leaders. So you mix those two parallel phenomena together, and you see why the overall impact of how people think, all that being so greatly accelerated by social networks, by some kind of hysterization of the public discourse because of the buzz phenomena and whatever is attached to which politicians adhere very often on both sides. And you get the reason for this overall movement towards the extreme right.
Dimitrios, I want to get your thoughts on the ingredients and the people who go to the polls, because I get the sense in Greece, the austerity measures and getting beat up economically as long as the people did there, these kinds of messages could resonate.
I was just going to say that. I mean, you have to remember, Greece is a country that just got out of extreme austerity. The everyday life in Greece, in Athens, and around the country is very hard. People are struggling to go to the supermarket, the everyday life. Obviously, this is a major factor when people went to the polls a couple of weeks ago. Just to go back to the point that I was trying to make before with the far-right parties, we saw, don't forget, about a year ago, the elected Golden Dawn, which was the neo-Nazi party that got into the parliament. Obviously, they, justice took care of it. They are in prison now. But the new party that got elected in Greece, the Spartans that I was talking about before, was elected with the help of the imprisoned leader of the neo-Nazi party. So this is very concerning. This is very worrisome for a lot of political leaders here in Greece. And again, the everyday hardship of everyday life that still exists because, of the economy still trying to, we're in a post-COVID era, so the economy is still trying to recover. This was a major factor, and a lot of the everyday problems people had in mind when they were going to the polls a couple of weeks ago.
And Claus, Joab, talking about this march to the right that we're witnessing, I guess the fears that crop up is when do you start to see somebody on the horizon like Viktor Orban in Hungary? I mean, he's been the prime minister since 2010. Since then, he's imposed these policies that target immigrants, the LGBTQ populations. He's cracked down on the press and the judiciary. Is that the fear in Europe?
Absolutely. And of course, the situation in Germany is particularly worrying, not just because of Germany's Nazi past, but also because of the division between East and West, which is still running deep in Germany. So there is quite a bit of support for the right, for the AfD, particularly in Eastern Germany. And the party is now, in opinion polls, more popular than Olaf Scholz's ruling SPD, Social Democratic Party. And the AfD itself, they are talking about being able to win the next general election. That is, of course, way off. And Olaf Scholz and others always say, when it comes to the elections, the Germans are more reasonable than when they express their opinions in opinion polls. And that is very true. Usually at elections, at least in Germany, the voters tend to go to the middle. They do not tend to go to either the left or right-wing extremes. Still, the rise of the AfD, in particular Eastern Germany, is very worrying, and that they recently won 2 local offices, political offices, that is symbolically at least very important. The offices as such are not particularly powerful or important, but it is symbolically important for the party. And immigration, I would say, plays a very dominant role in the argumentation of the AfD and in the appeal of the AfD to the general population in Germany, but also regarding right-wing parties in all of Europe. I think apart from political and economic insecurity, immigration is really the decisive factor. And that also includes Brexit in the UK only a few years ago.
Well, Claus, let me just dig a little bit deeper in that. You talk about the AfD. Germany has spent so many years reckoning with its past. I mean, can you talk to me about the general feelings that you get when you talk to people on the street about, this sense that this might be reemerging, this kind of sensibility?
Well, the AfD, of course, says it is not a Nazi party. It has nothing to do with Hitler's party many years ago, while the German police forces, they have recognized that the AfD is really an extreme right party and may be in violation of many parts of the German constitution. The AfD rejects that and tries to convince the German voter that it is just a normal party. It's only on the conservative side, and it wants to bring control and order to Germany and make people live in peace and stability, and of course try to improve the economy so that people have a better standard of living. That is so far not really bought by the majority of the German voters, but the appeal of the AfD and that mainstreaming, which the AfD is very busy doing and very successful in doing, that is definitely making inroads in a great number of voters. The AfD now polls over 20%. That is more than, as I said, Olaf Scholz's party. This is very disconcerting. That doesn't mean at the next election we will see the same number of voters going over to the AfD. Still, the opinion polls are disconcerting. And of course, the other parties have woken up and they try to do something about it by essentially moving also more to the right, like the CDU, the traditional Christian conservative party, party has a very strong anti-immigration policy adopted, and has very strict ideas about how to bring control and order and stability back to the German society. And that is, of course, something which then voters ask themselves, well, if the normal parties, the ordinary parties, pick up these more stricter rules for society, we can just as well vote AfD, who have had that idea in the first place. And this is what we see at the moment.
Very interesting. Reno, let's talk a little bit about France. French journalist and filmmaker Rakaya Diallo recently appeared on the show Democracy Now!, where she talked about what's going on in her country. Let's listen.
If you are a young man perceived as North African Arab or perceived as black, you are 20 times more likely to be checked by the police than if you belong to any other category. So that means that we do have figures. We know that certain groups in the population are explicitly targeted, and they are more likely to be checked and also to be killed.
She's talking, of course, about this teenager killed by police that unleashed a number of riots there in France. How has that changed the landscape rather politically in France, would you say?
I think there's been, what was for me a pretty surprising outcome, is that following this uprising of the youth, and as Rakaya Diallo said, there is, despite the fact that it's illegal to collect ethnic statistics in France, there is widespread evidence that France has a big problem of social mobility and discriminations. But despite that, the result of the uprising has been a crackdown against the protester, more police, and there has been no proposal in France to do anything to support what they were asking for. So we're talking about a young man being killed by the police. You would expect at least some kind of reaction of the government trying to support them. So there seemed that catering to what the extreme right is wanting, so showing we want law and order, we want more police people, was seen by the government of Macron, who is supposed to be pretty much progressive on values, was seen as more important than doing anything to protect the people who are actually the victim of police violence. And so, of course, this is something pretty worrying, because this plays in the playbook of Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, Joab, to that point, the Financial Times recently had the headline, Marine Le Pen seizes on French riots in a push to outflank Emmanuel Macron. In the story, they cited an opinion poll which shows that her response is actually resonating with French voters more than Macron. Can you describe what's happening, and does this play into her hands in a sense?
Yes, it does play in her hands, at least in the short run. And which is also something that we have already seen in France and elsewhere when it comes to a series of punctual crises, especially when you have extreme right parties leadership with some kind of, how should I say, political wisdom. Now, Madame Le Pen has been leading her party after the leadership of her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. I was speaking about almost 30 years now. She has accumulated experience, and she, operationally speaking, she is rather successful. What she's doing right now, for example, and when I say right now, I mainly have in mind the 2 or 3 major recent crises. That is the COVID, the war in Ukraine, although her position relatively affiliated with Putin was a problematic one from her point of view, and then, of course, the riots and the violence in the streets very recently. What she does is sort of a minimal approach. She's very cautious. She's very wise, should I say, and that works. That works mainly because the overall political discourse has been degraded over the last 2-3 decades, not only in Europe, mainly due to, I think, phenomena which are perhaps outside the direct political scene, related perhaps to media elements, perhaps to overall moods and things like that. But things are running more rapidly this time on the public scene, and answers should be found more quickly, more rapidly, more immediately, which of course privileges those who have more populist and more superficial solutions, such as the great majority of extreme right leaders.
Demetrius, Italy is in the G7. It's now what many consider to having a far-right prime minister. She sought to assure voters, though, that that's not the case. Let's listen to some comments from her.
I have been reading that the win of Fratelli d'Italia in the September elections would mean a disaster, leading to an authoritarian turn, Italy's departure from the euro, and other nonsense of this sort. None of this is true.
So she says she's not far right. Talk to us about her victory, what it says about the populist movement, and also some people were actually kind of surprised the NATO meeting recently about Ukraine. She reiterated her country's support for Ukraine, and as we've been talking about, that's been the worrying side of this, that perhaps some of these leaders would pull away from the support of Ukraine. What do we read into that? Do you see her tacking more to the center?
Well, certainly. I mean, we kind of experienced this with the whole Brexit thing. A lot of people thought that at some point, the prime minister at the time, who was a leftist prime minister, Prime Minister Tsipras, that would lead the country out of the euro, that they would lead the country out of the union. None of that happened. And I think in cases like that, people tend to move towards the center. Now, as far as Italy is concerned, I certainly think this was a major change for Italy. The Italian people and the Italian voters are still trying to cope with the new government. They're still trying to figure out what is happening. And, she's being very vocal about the whole NATO thing and, Italy's relationship to NATO. Italy's approach to the whole, war in Ukraine. And that's very concerning to some. But at the end of the day, I really do think, like I said before, that people are trying to still figure out where she stands. And I think as we see her government progress and as we see this government it will take some time until we see her real intentions. And now I also wanted to add, as far as Greece is concerned, we also saw a very interesting direction to the right with the whole Spartans party because of national security and national security issues. So not only because of the economy, not only because of immigration, not only because of the war in Ukraine, but also because of Turkey's aggression. So a lot of people thought that if they move to the right, maybe policy will change when it comes to national issues and the relationship with Turkey and Turkey's aggression.
Claus, let me ask you about the Trump factor, because we are hearing that Steve Bannon has been helping far-right leaders from Le Pen to Meloni. How much of an influence there?
Oh, clearly, Trump is the ideal, the model of many right-wing parties in Europe, not perhaps openly, but they admire him. And of course, the same is true in the United States. Whether it is likely that Trump will be even nominated by the Republican Party and then re-elected by the American people to the presidency, it's very questionable. But that he was able to be president for 4 years, that is being heralded and lauded everywhere among right-wing circles. And what we will see when we see the takeover of the right in Europe, as we have partially seen, for example, in Italy, is not the sudden collapse of the EU, but it's more like what Orban has done in Hungary. We will see the gradual undermining of democracy, the gradual undermining of law and order in a democratic sense, so that the judiciary will be controlled by the government, will not be controlled by parliament. And I think that will spread, and that also means that the EU will change its policy in its liberal policy, which is keen on helping developing countries, for example. That will over time be undermined. So I fear that the rise of the right, particularly if they take over power, will undermine Europe's standing in the world and make Europe even less of an influential power in world politics than it is at the moment anyway. And that, I think, is the real danger of the right, not a sudden collapse of the EU or sudden imposition of dictatorships all over Europe, but the gradual undermining of democratic institutions and norms and order.
And Joab, let me ask you about that, this undermining, this chipping away. How do you see that impacting the EU?
I agree to a large extent with my colleague from North Carolina. We're speaking perhaps more about the liberalism-illiberalism balance than in direct terms of influence on world affairs, or the capacity, anyway limited, of the EU, made of 27 different countries, to come out with a common defense or foreign policy, which has never been the case, and which is getting perhaps somehow better due to the extreme circumstances because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. But still, I think that it would be measured up to indeed values which are those related to liberalism and values of democracy, and what do they actually mean when you run a country or run a continent. And this might see the overall influence of Europe in the overall geostrategic balance between North America, Asia, China, and Europe actually being less comfortable from a European point of view. And actually, a rising extreme right is working this way.
Klaus, let me ask you about this. We've been talking about this kind of in a political sense, you know, politically, what does all of this mean? But let's talk about a people sense. If I'm an immigrant or I'm from a marginalized community, and you're seeing the rise of some of these leaders with their comments that they have, how concerned should I be?
Oh, sure. I think you should be very concerned. Life for an immigrant, particularly for a refugee or political asylum seeker, is of course always very difficult and very uncomfortable. Job-wise, security-wise, making a living and connecting to friends and family, all that is of course extremely difficult if you have to flee to a foreign country. And the institutions in many European countries try to help refugees. There's a very liberal political asylum law in most countries still, and that will be undermined, and that will be done away with to a large extent. So the idea of right-wing parties is, of course, to bring much fewer immigrants, to let much fewer immigrants into the country, and to select them perhaps also on the basis of race and color of skin, and also education and qualifications. And that will make life for many immigrants more impossible, or certainly even more uncomfortable than it is anyway. So refugees and immigrants will have an even tougher life in the future if the right comes to power in more countries than just one or two, as we have seen so far.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your insights. It's been a great discussion, and thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.